a papal bull in the style of a Carolingian era piece. And so it's a fantasy piece, but it's in Latin and it follows all of the other rules. The first thing you see me doing here is to cut my quill. And so I'm retrimming a quill and doing adjustments. I'm going to show you a little bit of kind of what preparation work takes place. As you can see, I have a printout of the text that I'm going to do. I have the historic examples sitting there beside me for the text style that I want to write in, the hand I want to write in. And the other piece is I get as close as I can with a font in terms of size and spacing. It's not always the same style, but usually size and spacing that I'm going to do, so I can lay it out and kind of figure out what my spacing is, what my dimensions are. Sometimes I go through more work on this, sometimes not. So I'm also marking out and pin pricking this scrap of parchment. Things don't look the same on paper or on cardstock as they do on parchment, and so I tend to do all of my practice work to make sure that the hand and the calligraphy style look correct and behave correctly on parchment. So I'm using a bronze stylus, the same thing I'm going to do on the original piece to sketch things out. And this is my ink horn with a hole built into the slope that holds my iron gall ink. And so this ink is made using a historic recipe and made based on medieval recipes. So I'm dipping my quill that I've freshly cut, and then I'm going to write one of the lines and make sure things look right and the spacing looks right. One of the things I realized when writing this first line is that the quill is cut too wide and too heavy. It's something that I have a bad habit of doing, is that in first pass I think things should be a heavier line than they actually are a lot of the times. And so this is, I realized that this is wrong, and so I do it again. And so I actually write the next line, but I do the next space using a lighter cutting of the quill, so it's a narrower nib effectively, but it's all in how you cut the quill. I also made it a little bit more flexible so that as I'm coming down there's some weighting on the bottom. So once I've figured out what I'm doing, what the spacing is, what the size is, what the hand is, and I kind of get it practiced and right, this was not my first time to practice, I then go through and I pin prick the original. And so this is me taking my scribe's knife and pin pricking all of my measurements on both sides of this parchment piece for the final piece. And there it is. So this is one side. Do the other side, but hopefully we don't have to watch that. The whole process, I'm alternating everything in real time and then speeding it up 10 times. And so actually doing this in real time, this whole piece took about 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours total, including kind of setup and preparation time. And then doing all of my lines, different techniques in different time periods and different hands require different lining techniques. These are what are generally referred to as scribal schools, and scribal schools varied by region, but they also varied pretty heavily in time period as well. So certain schools would change and develop over time, and so your lining and your pinprick styles would change. This manuscript specifically, I did something that I don't really do very often, which is I worked concurrently with a red paint for the red lettering as well as the iron gall ink for the black lettering. And so this is me. I've mixed up some egg tempera paint. This is in Glare, which is based in egg whites and gum arabic. And I load up the quill with a paintbrush. And so what that does is it allows me to control where it is and not overflow it. I can just dip it in the quill and scrape it up. It works a little bit better if it's a deeper dish, and I didn't really feel like finding one. So I do an initial letter. It is the big theta, because the first word is actually in Greek. I actually don't end up keeping this the way it is. I end up hating it and completely redoing it, making it a more solid piece for that large theta at the beginning. And then I write the first word and the first letter of the next word in this red. Something I found in doing this, that the transitions, because the paint will dry on the quill, and so I have to clean off the quills in between each color change and kind of keep things covered and sealed. Iron Gall ink doesn't behave that poorly in this situation because I'm doing like one red letter, so it's not that long. And then, so pour out the ink, get that ink ready, and begin to write. So the knife you'll see I'm holding in my left hand above it. What that does is parchment is flexible and it moves a lot. And so I have to hold down the parchment to the page, to the slope, and so that it will stay in place and behave and kind of keep me from slipping. And so first word, Pontifex, and then I realize, oh yeah, the next one's in red. And so now I have to do the changeover. And so you can see the time that this takes now. Again, when I'm writing words, most of the time you're seeing it at 10 times. This I really kept at pace. And so it's not too bad, but it does take about a minute to kind of transition colors there and back. And so then I write the next letter. You'll notice the red takes a little bit longer. It's because that paint itself does not flow quite as freely as the ink does. It's also inclined to clog the slit in the quill, and so it has to be opened up a little bit more, pushed down a little bit more, makes it a little bit more flexible, but if it's too flexible, then it opens up too much and it doesn't behave. And so it's always cleaner to write with the paint for lettering with a quill, but it's always just a little bit more work than writing with a regular ink. And so then clean it off in the water cup and then go back to the black and writing it out. So this hand, I actually did two different hands for this piece. The first one is a rustic Roman capitals, and those capitals make a really nice title line and were historically accurate for pieces like this. And then the rest of it is actually in a Carolingian hand that matches the time period we were going for here. This piece in particular is in the 11th to 12th century-ish. It's the organization it's for is actually a fantasy organization, but has a lot of medieval influences. And so I went through and kind of picked something that kind of matched the feeling that the client wanted. And again, at this point, it's just writing. And so it's more writing. This is, again, 10 times speed, which means it takes much more. You can see me recutting the quill for the red work there. Loading it up. And this one is thankfully not just a single letter. It's actually a couple of words, if I remember correctly. Nope, one. And then clean everything off. And this is what seems to make this take a lot longer, but I'm able to get much better spacing than I normally would. So we finished up that line and continue on. I found that by transitioning back and forth between the colors, my letter spacing and my line spacing was much more consistent than when I leave a block of space that is probably right and then come back in and fill it in with the color. While working concurrently, I really think it ended up looking a lot better. And so here I realized that the parchment's not really behaving the way I want it to behave. And so I take the ponce, which is gum sandrak and cuttlebone ground up together in a little cloth bag, and then kind of pound it onto the parchment, which allows it to fill up those pores and seal things. It does a couple of things. The sandrak seals the pores and can seal the fibers, whereas the cuttlebone actually helps to absorb oils and things like that. So that was me testing on another scrap of parchment to make sure that it was just the parchment consistency. I realized that it wasn't just the parchment consistency, it was also the quill giving me problems. So then I retrimmed the end of that quill, just cut the tip off, and then adjusted the thickness a little tiny bit to get ready for that next line. It did seem to behave a whole lot better after this. This hand in particular is not very slow. It's actually fairly quick to do. But one of the things is when I'm doing single pieces for clients and I'm not just working on a book, I try to work much slower and more precisely. So here I am stretching for the first time. This is a couple hours into working, and I should have stretched much sooner because it does start to cause a lot of tendon pain. Writing really precisely does. Again, you can see holding that knife in the left hand to hold the page down is pretty much a consistency, and you'll see me move it along as I'm writing. If I don't do that, then I get to a part of the parchment that is a little bit buckled or a little bit curved, and then it's not being held down correctly. You can see how well those guidelines are helping, and they actually start to disappear once you've written a little bit, and they start to wear out a little bit, and you don't really notice them too much, although historically those lines would have been left on the page, and they might wear over time, but you'll still see evidences of them. So again, that parchment needed touched up just a little bit. So this parchment in particular had some greasy spots, probably from where I set my hand and from me touching it more than anything else. So switching colors, again, there are a lot of these color switches which require putting the paint back on that quill and then writing again. This is working at 10 times speed. What I really liked about this piece was that I got to keep the same weight of letters, the same style of letters, but just alternating colors to add interest. Not a whole lot of illumination, not a whole lot of pictures and borders and things like that, but a very clean, simple piece. So I write out the two words that are in red for this section. I think it's grandem magistrum. But what I don't show is that I realized I had made a mistake on the line before, and I knew I had made this mistake, but I continued on writing to allow that to dry. So now that that has dried, I go back through with my knife and I scrape away the ink on the letter that's in error. I knew I had left enough space to be able to fit in the replacement letter because I knew that the T occupied about the same amount of space as the letter I need to replace it with. So I go through, I scrape it. This one actually scraped pretty cleanly. Then I use the pounce again to seal, because when you scrape it, you open up some of the fibers again, and they need to be sealed up. And so then I'm able to add that S in. And actually, by the time we're all done, you can't even really tell that I made a correction, which is one of the things I really, really like a lot, is being able to correct mistakes on parchment. And it's one of the skills, one of the things you'll actually see in a lot of illuminated manuscripts, is you'll find mistakes, and you'll find how those mistakes are dealt with. And there's different ways to deal with them. They can either be erased and replaced, they can be crossed out, they can be dotted, you can add little insertions. There's lots of ways that they were historically just fixed, some more obvious than others. Usually when I'm doing a piece for a client, I really try to make it as non-obvious as possible. Again, here we are, one more mistake. You can tell I'm getting a little bit tired as I'm going, inclined to make more mistakes when I get to that point. And so this one was fun. Basically, I had drawn the wrong T because there's other versions of this hand that use a different T, and in my brain I'll start to default to some of the earlier things I did. So I fixed that, add the I in. Actually, no, I started drawing the O, so I got half of the O and had to do the I to replace that. And so then writing in the last words in this size. And so what I do now is I cut my quill down, because we're adding a final line that's much, much finer, much, much smaller. Basically, it's a date line that explains what the date is, time period, all of that. One of the things about this manuscript that's different from what you would find in an extant manuscript that's in this hand and time period is that a lot of the S's that I do, even ones that aren't at the end of a word, I'm using a regular, what we think of as a regular S, a curved S instead of a long S, because the client decided that he wanted it more readable and didn't want people to have to deal with long S's, which tend to look like an F to us. So this is the final of the piece. It was relatively simple, but I just really liked how it looked. So the last thing that I did was I then had to cast the bulla, the actual lead bulla that went with this piece. So it's a two-sided bulla. I created a mold and cast it in pewter, in lead actually, and then put it on with a fibrous string. So this is hand-spun linen.